And we are live. So good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everybody, wherever in the world you happen to be watching this. Thank you for joining in today. We hope you'll find it nice and interesting, and we'll give you a chance to ask some interesting questions of our experts on the panel. So my name is Mike. I work for a company called Ocean Infinity, who are involved in a lot of marine and geoscience data acquisition. But I'm also part of the Marine Studies group of the Geological Society. I'll be moderating this webinar today, introducing each of our wonderful speakers, and then making sure we get through as many of your questions as possible. So today, we're going to be talking about how marine geoscience helps us understand some of the deepest parts of our oceans. More people have been to the moon than to the deepest part of the ocean on Earth, so it's part of our planet that we're still learning lots about. Now, marine geoscience itself is the study of the ocean floor and the associated processes that help form our planet, our continents, and also continue to drive a lot of what happens to us as human beings. It also helps us find and harvest energy. It shows us what has happened to our world climate in the past, and it gives us insight into what we can expect in the next few generations. So as you know, this event is being live broadcast on both Zoom and YouTube, and we should have plenty of time at the end for questions in the second half of the webinar. You can ask these using the question and answer function on Zoom or by sending them to us on Twitter or Instagram. Make sure that you upvote your favorite questions when they appear, and we'll put them to our panel of speakers towards the end. However, before we introduce our first speaker, I want to quickly talk about the Marine Studies Group. We are a special interest group of the Geological Society of London, focusing on encouraging research, teaching, and public understanding of marine geoscience and its applications. We do this by arranging scientific meetings and workshops, webinars like today, and generally providing a focus and outlet for the Geological Society's marine interests. You can find more information online, as well as on the Geological Society, with resources, career information, and loads of other useful links. So check that out when you can. So how is today going to work? The webinar will run for about an hour, from 5 until 6 p.m. here in the UK. And we have 3 great experts who are each going to give a short presentation of about 10 minutes, showcasing some of their areas of research and how they apply marine geoscience to finding out more about the deepest oceans in the world. After the speakers have all given a presentation, we'll have plenty of time for questions, as I said. So please make sure you ask them throughout the event. You don't have to wait until the end. If you think of a question during any of the talks, send it in, and when they're all come in, I'll moderate the session to get through as many as we can. Just to remind you, if you've joined via Zoom, use the Q&A function on here. And if you're watching on YouTube, then you can use our Twitter and Instagram handles to send in questions, and they'll get added to the list. Make sure you use the thumbs up to pick any questions that you like the look of and that you'd like to hear answers to, and we'll make sure that we do those ones first. So our first speaker is Mickey Strasser. After his undergrad at ETH Zurich in Switzerland, he completed postgraduate degrees in Switzerland again, followed by Bremen in Germany, before moving to the University of Innsbruck in Austria, where he's currently a professor of sedimentary geology. So Mickey, over to you.
Okay, here we go. Thank you so much, Mike, and hello, everybody. I hope you can hear me and see my slides now. It's a really great pleasure to be on the panel here and talk to all the people and students out there about a specific integrated ocean discovery program expedition, which is actually right now going on the Japan Trench to study paleoseismology. Paleoseismology is the study of past earthquake, where we aim at tracking these past earthquakes in the sediment record of the deep sea. And I have the pleasure to talk here on behalf of my co-chief colleague, Kenny Gihara, the expedition manager, and actually the entire IODP expedition 386 science party. And I also have the pleasure here, before going into to introduce this international project, to introduce you a little bit into the theme of today's webinar, which is the deepest of the deep. But how deep is deep? And I start this with showing you this map, a global distribution of ocean depth, where I basically colored yellow everything that is actually shallower than 5 kilometers of water depth, which is already a tremendously deep water section. And if we even go deeper into the red part, and this is what we call the Hadal Ocean, then we see actually only very few places, mostly around the Pacific Rim here and so in Indonesia, is actually this deepest part of our ocean, which is only 2% of the total seafloor. And when we look a little bit into Earth and like deeper below the seafloor, and I do that here in the example of a transect across the island of Japan and into the Pacific plate, we show you an animation how actually the plates that kind of cover our Earth are moving, and we already see here that the oceanic plate is kind of being what we call subducted, so basically is moving below the overriding plate. And you see already that due to this kind of down dragging of this oceanic plate, we form these very deep trenches, which form the deepest places on our planet. There is another process going on when we have such a subduction, plate motions, because two Earth plates, they kind of move along each other, and there is friction which accommodates a strain, and at a certain point, the strain is kind of the energy that is stored is being released, causing rupture, what we call Megathrust Rupture, which actually are the earthquakes that then release, and you see that the elasticity of the upper plate has also stored energy. And at the moment when this earthquake occur, you will see that kind of a lot of vibration occur. That's what we know as earthquake, but also the energy is kind of put into the water column, transferred to the water column, and this is what causes tsunami waves that then travel across the ocean and have these devastating effects on the coastline, such as we have like the last major tsunami that we have experienced on this planet. This is about 10 years ago, which was the March 11, 2011 Tohoku or Oki earthquake, so-called giant earthquake, because it reached magnitude 9 and higher, that caused that tsunami that also had devastating effects and caused the Fukushima nuclear power plant disaster. So when we look on a global distribution of earthquakes, as we have measured them with hundreds and thousands of seismometers, then we see that actually most of the earthquakes, and these are all these black dots here, they mimic basically our planet's plate boundaries. And you see again these kind of Pacific Rim, we call it the Pacific Rim of Fire, because that's the places where the earthquake occur and also where the volcanoes are located. So we see this global distribution of earthquake. But highlighted here in yellow are 4 earthquakes that instruments have recorded over the last about 100 years. So I have here a data set where it starts in 1900 and it goes to 2010. I should add some more data points because obviously we are in 2021. But as I mentioned before, the Japan earthquake was the last of this giant earthquake that reached a magnitude threshold higher than 9, indicated by this line, as you can see here on the y-axis, the magnitude. So there are really kind of few exceptional events that reach this tremendous magnitude and cause tsunami waves that we have recovered in the instrumental record. So if we want to answer these questions, where and how often do such giant earthquakes occur, we actually scientifically kind of have to admit we do not really know. Because short historical and even shorter instrumental record limit our perspective of earthquakes' maximum magnitude and recurrence. We can go into historic records, but even on historical time scales. So we know a few more that are just reported in history, but we still lack epidemiistic understanding, and we need to kind of come with, and that's what the marine geology studies is, we need to go into prehistoric events. We need to examine the prehistoric that are only preserved in the geological record. And this is essential to understand long-term history of such giant earthquakes. And as I showed you before, due to the plate motions, they mostly occur in these very, very deep sea trenches. So a question then maybe is, but how are earthquakes recorded in the sediments of the seafloor? And to illustrate you this, I show you a movie that was filmed by divers upon rather smallish earthquake, magnitude 5.7 earthquake. And what you will see is how the seafloor shakes. And we can observe what happens. So the earthquake kicks in now, where you see the rubbles moving, but you also see that all the fine mud that is normally covered on the ocean floor is kind of goes into suspension. It forms these sediment suspension clouds, and these giant earthquakes, they have durations of about 2 minutes. So the ocean floor is actually shaking for about 2 minutes. So tremendous amount of fine-grained sediments are put into suspension and then taken up by gravity, like an avalanche or sediment suspension flow follows gravity and is being deposited in the final depot center, which again are these deep sea trenches that we want to explore. We learned a lot about the Tohoku-Oki earthquakes when several research cruises over the last 10 years went onto this Japan trench, where again you see the Pacific plate being subducted below the Japanese island, forming this up to 8-kilometer deep trench here. And we can study what is the fingerprint of an earthquake in the deep sea. And what research has revealed by like monitoring the event, one key information we learned that even 4 months after the earthquakes in 7-kilometer depth, video observation still has revealed that about a 40-meter thick turbide layer, this is the sediment that has been kind of mobilized and went into suspension, still is kind of hanging around in the deep sea trench and really slowly settles on the ocean floor. We can go and take some sediment cores and study a variety of physical and chemical and biological proxies, and we can study these characteristic fingerprints of the Tohoku-Oki earthquake, but then also kind of go out and take deeper cores, because in the deep sea trench, kind of the history of the sedimentation processes is recorded, so we can go deeper into the subsurface and study this. And this is all about the IODP expedition 386. And you see the research vessel Kaimei kind of lowers the cable down here 8 kilometers. It takes several hours just to lower the probing tool, which is a giant piston core. And you see here, so we just zoom into this lowermost part here, and you see here basically a tube, a cylindric tube, and like a trigger in front of it that comes down once the trigger hits the ocean floor by gravity. The giant piston current goes in and samples the sub-seafloor history of sedimentation and sedimentation events. So we have the Tohoku-Oki earthquake layer on top of it, and in the deeper subsurface, we have several more of these layers that show characteristic fingerprints similar to the Tohoku-Oki earthquake. At least that is what has been revealed by reflection seismic and subsurface imaging site surveys. So by this expedition now, we basically take up the history recorded in the sedimentary archive and bring it back to the ship where we can analyze it. And this brings us to the research goals of this expedition, that we want to identify the fingerprint of earthquake event layers in the sedimentary archive and go further back in time. And in particular, we do this at several study sites. And conceptually, we are using these sites as our natural seismometer that has been recording the earthquake activity over time scales far into prehistoric time, and the range that we hope to study in the Japan Trench with this expedition is in the order of 50 to 100,000 years. So this will unravel a long-term history of giant earthquakes. And this will hopefully help to answer the basic question I addressed at the beginning of my presentation. How often do giant earthquakes occur? Are they clustered in time, or do they, what's their pattern, and what can we learn fundamentally about earthquake processes, but also what can be the consequences, both in terms of societal hazard impacts to the coastline, but also, and maybe scientifically, fundamentally, at least to me as a scientist, even more awarding and interesting to things like the biology of the deep sea and cycles of elements and mass cycles on our planet on these long time scales. So these are the major objectives and the science that we are doing. And as I said before, the expedition is going on right now. I think the Japanese colleagues on board the vessel, they are probably sleeping right now, and myself, I'm sitting here in Innsbruck because the COVID situation unfortunately didn't allow me to travel. So we have a fantastic Japanese team that actually is running this expedition, and they already have successfully recovered 9 of these natural seismometers that we now can read and learn about past earthquake history. We have recovered about 455 meters of core so far, and we hit 2 records, which we're kind of proud of. We cored the deepest water site, which is at 8,000 meter, 8 kilometer deep water depth, and we recovered the deepest sub-seafloor sample ever recorded within this scientific ocean drilling program. So there have been other expeditions that cored even deeper, like in the Mariana Trench or so. But within this international ocean drilling program, this is the first time where these ultra depths have been reached. Okay, so there are still 8 more sites to go. The expedition is continuing for another 3 weeks. We cross our finger that we will be successful to recover all the seismometers, all the natural seismometers in this deep sea trench. And I end here my presentation with a movie where you can see that the ocean actually is not just a flat surface, but it has secrets stored in deep sea sediments that we can uncover with giant piston coring here just being uptaken by the ship. And I leave this here. Again, acknowledge that I have the chance to talk to you, and I'm very happy to take some questions after in the Q&A. Thank you very much for your attention.
Great, thanks very much, Mickey. That was really interesting. So moving swiftly on. Our next presenter is Heather Stewart from the British Geological Survey. And after studying for her highs in Scotland, she studied at the University of Glasgow, taking a geology and applied geology BSc. She doesn't have a PhD at the moment, but the British Geological Survey are currently funding her to do one, I believe. So that's a nice perk of working for the BGS. But yeah, looking forward to hearing what she has to say.
Hi there, hi. Let me just get going. Okay, thank you very much for the invite to present to you all today, and thank you for the wonderful introduction. So I would like to talk to you today about finding and mapping some of the deepest places on Earth, and thank you, Mickey, for telling us about the Hadal Zone, and it's these areas which exceed sort of 6,000 meters water depth that I'm going to take you to. A bit of a whistle-stop tour in the next sort of 10 minutes or so. So I'm specifically going to talk to you about the 5 Deeps expedition, and this was conceived by explorer Victor Vescovo, who wanted to dive to the deepest point in each of the Earth's 5 oceans. But the only issue is that at that time we didn't know exactly where the deepest point in each ocean was. So we published a desk study exploring sort of that, so that we had a roadmap, a plan of where we were going to go during our global expedition. So we looked at published bathymetry data, so that's information on water depth. And some of these records went back hundreds of years from various expeditions over that time period. But the upshot is that the areas like the Pacific and the Atlantic Oceans, the deepest point was pretty well nailed down. A lot of expeditions had been to the Puerto Rico Trench and the Mariana Trench, just because it is the deepest place on Earth. Challenger Deep is 10,924 meters deep. But for a long time, people thought that the deepest place on Earth was a place called Horizon Deep in the Tonga Trench, and that's located in the South Pacific. So you can just sort of see in the map there, all the deeps indicated by the red spots. But the published depths for the Mariana and the Tonga trenches were actually pretty close in terms of sort of what that figure was. It was within sort of 100 and 150 meters of each other, so that's within some of the error margins of some of the technology that we use to measure water depth. In the same sort of conversation there, the same study, the deepest point of the Indian Ocean could be either the Java Trench or the Diamantina Fracture Zone. And again, the known depths for these 2 locations was pretty close. The other issue is that we realised it isn't exactly obvious where the Southern Ocean starts. Where is the boundary between the Southern Ocean and the Atlantic Ocean, the Pacific Ocean and the Indian Oceans? So, and depending on which expert you talk to, if it's an oceanographer or a policymaker, all sorts of different disciplines, marine disciplines, all have slightly different opinions about where that boundary between the Southern Ocean and all the other oceans are. So basically, before we set off on our round world trip, we knew where we were going basically in the Arctic, the Atlantic and the Pacific Ocean, but the data quality was really poor in the Indian Ocean and the Southern Ocean. So really, we were going to have to go out and map it all ourselves. So in order to map the deeps, you need to use a piece of equipment called a multi-beam echo sounder, and we use sound. So a multi-beam emits hundreds of beams of sound in a swath, and we measure the length of time it takes for the sound to travel down from the system, which is mounted on a vessel, down to the seafloor, bounce off the seafloor, and we record the sound back when it gets back to the ship. So you can see in the image there that basically what you end up doing is that you get a corridor of information, and you just sort of go out and model on, and you acquire all these corridors of high resolution water depth information, and then you use that to create a digital terrain model, and that shows the topography of the seafloor in more detail than you could have done before. So we can start to look at processes. As Mickey was saying in the first presentation there, both modern and geologically old, that have shaped and moulded the seafloor. And we've just got a couple of examples there. One of those is from the offshore Scotland. And we've got data that shows the imprint of previous glaciations. These lines are moraines. And then we've got an image of one of the deepest places in the Southern Ocean. So once we found our map of where we were going to go while we were going around the world visiting 5 oceans, Victor needed a submarine that he could pilot himself in order to visit those places. So he commissioned a new submarine to be built by Triton Submarines, the Deep Submergence Vehicle Limiting Factor. So I won't go into too much detail here, but there's a link on the top there to a little YouTube video that shows how they made limiting factor. It's really quite cool. So if you've got time, you should go and have a little look at that. But just to sort of show you a little bit more detail about the sub, you can see the sphere there. It looks like it's got teeth sort of in the bottom there, and the teeth, the sort of teeth-shaped things. That's your oxygen. That's your air supply in there, and you can see the 2 seats. But if we just sort of overlay some information across the top, you've got various sonars and communications equipment. You can see the trunk where you get down into the titanium sphere where the two people, the pilot and the passenger, sit. You can see at the bottom there, you've got the weights, which are just tucked underneath the sphere, and the batteries down at the bottom there. So all the weight is down low. The whole thing is encased in sort of buoyancy, syntactic foam, and we've got thrusters as well on the side, so we can maneuver across the seafloor. But you can see that the whole submarine is sort of shaped like a tear, sort of teardrop shape, and that's so that it can go really, really fast up and down through the water column. And then once it's down there, you use the thrusters in order to maneuver across the seafloor. So we put a multi-beam system so that we could map the deeps, and we put the submarine so we could visit the deeps onto a ship called the Pressure Drop. And we took Pressure Drop around the world in 10 months and covered sort of 46,000 miles in the process. I won't take you on the full 10-month journey in the time available, but I couldn't resist showing you some pictures from the trip first. Fieldwork is the best part of my job. I'm sure the other panelists would agree. You not only get to see some amazing places, but you get to work with a lot of interesting people with different skills, you know, like engineers, biologists, the people who work on the ship, the officers and crew. I mean, if you want to get into marine science, I mean, it's a fantastic career to have. But that's us in South Georgia. You can see one of the glaciers in South Georgia in the background there from Pressure Drop. But I mean, the Southern Ocean, or being down south, as they say, is just one of the most spectacular places to get to work. So, and just as you'd expect, it's like a BBC documentary. You really do just have to pinch yourself when you're working down there, because there's penguins and glaciers, whales, everything. But enough of my holiday snaps. Back to the mapping. As I said, some of the areas we planned to visit had some data available already, like the Mariana Trench, but the South Sandwich Trench, which is what I've got a picture of here, it was not one of them. The data quality was really poor. It was only, it was pretty much just satellite data that was available to us before, and you can sort of see that, you know, you only get a broad sense as to what the shape of the trench is. You know, you just sort of know that there's a deep there. So the deepest place in the South Sandwich Trench is the Meteor Deep, which is north of the area. But when we went and looked at this sort of low resolution data, you know, there were other places that could be the deepest place as well, going right down the trench axis. But as I said, the definition of where the Southern Ocean starts is different depending on the expert that you talk to. If you talk to an oceanographer, they want to put the boundary between the Southern Ocean and the Atlantic Ocean as a migrating boundary that changes seasonally with ocean currents. So during the sort of summer months, it's north of the winter months, it's north of the island of South Georgia, and at other times of the year, it's much further south, much closer to the continent. Policymakers as well also have a different opinion as to where the boundary between the Southern Ocean and the Atlantic Ocean is. And we took that, the boundary defined in the Antarctic Treaty, and they put the boundary between the two oceans as 60 degrees south. So we were lucky enough to go and survey there, and we managed to acquire high resolution mapping, this multi-beam data that I was describing earlier, along the entire trench axis. So it was about 15,000 kilometers square. So that's almost the size of Wales, an area that we covered. And the deepest point in the Southern Ocean is right down in the south, this little box C, and it's a deep called Factorian Deep, and it's 7,432 meters deep. So I think that's about 30 times the height of the Eiffel Tower. And what's really great is that we're not only looking for the deepest point, we're starting to look at what makes these trenches, what makes the seafloor of these trenches different shapes. And the basin at the bottom there, you know, it's a complex interplay of the fabric. So when the plate was formed back at the mid-ocean ridge, it has got that sort of fabric. So it's taken that shape as it was formed, trundled across the ocean basin, and as it's been subducted, it's the fabric that it got when it was made makes all these enclosed basins. The fracture zones when it was made have made all these enclosed basins. But the deepest point in the entire trench is actually the Meteor Deep up in the north, but that's in the Atlantic Ocean, and that's 8,265 meters deep. It was discovered in 1926 by the Germans on, it's called Meteor Deep because it's named after the vessel that discovered it. And the Germans actually, when they measured it using a really early type of echo sounder, they measured it to be 8,264 meters deep. So they were only a meter out. So that's pretty cool. Like the South Sandwich Trench, there was surprisingly little data available for the Java Trench. So when we came and mapped it, we managed to reveal lots of really exciting things. We've got these large, you can just start to pick out these large fault escarpments. So that's where the plate is kind of breaking as it's getting forced and subducted under the plate to the north. And these fault escarpments are sort of 500 meters high, and they're so sort of prevalent that they're cutting up the seamounts that are also being pulled into the trench axis. Seamounts are important because they're hotspots of biodiversity, and the subduction of seamounts have got a really big impact on sort of how the whole sort of subduction process is going on. We also found, once you get your eye in, you start to see these little cauliflower shapes on the seafloor, and these are submarine landslides that we didn't know were there previously. So it's really exciting to start to look at some of these submarine landslides. And some of the other seamounts that we've got coming in towards the trench axis, they've also got little submarine landslides on their flanks. And some of these are potentially tsunamigenic. So it is quite important that we find and document that these things exist, and start to look at modelling what was happening in the past. As well as mapping, we also had access to the submarine and a fleet of scientific landers, and we were able to get really great images of the sea floor. And that allows sort of geologists like myself to start to look at the rock formations that are down there, start to look at the composition of the sea floor, and the biologists that we're working with can start to look at the fauna and the other organisms that live in these deep, deep places. So you can see the bright oranges and whites and yellows, and these are chemosynthetic bacterial mats, and they're living off fluids that are coming up through the cracks in the rocks there. And you can see there we've got a deep Dumbo octopus there and a stalked Ascidian in the bottom right there. The little sort of blob just above that is a sea cucumber, which is pretty cool. So these images were all from Java Trench. Here's are some images from other trenches. So the South Sandwich Trench there, we found, this was the first time we'd found a hadal fish in the Southern Ocean. So this video is from 6,000 meters deep in the South Sandwich Trench. Found lots of new species of fish and amphipods, which are the sort of little crustaceans that we've got in picture there. We saw a lot of chemosynthetic bacterial mats, and that's the bright yellows that you can see in the picture on the bottom left from Mariana and from the Tonga Trench as well. And we also found some relic sort of hydrothermal vents, which is the image in the bottom right there in the Mariana Trench, and that's on the flanks of one of these big seamounts that are being sort of carried on the tectonic plate down in towards the axis. But what does it feel like to go down in a submarine? Just really quickly, I was lucky enough to get the opportunity in the Arctic Ocean, and we did a dive to look at the rock formations on a seamount in the Arctic Ocean. So I got to go down in the submarine. You sort of climb down through the exit and entrance trunk that I showed earlier in the presentation, and you sit in the titanium sphere, and you've got viewports, and it is just amazing. You know, the moment where you get cleared to dive and you're bobbing on the sea surface, you're moving around quite a lot. The waves are sort of pushing the submarine around, but once you're cleared to dive, you just free fall down through the water column. It's still, it's calm, it's just amazing. The changing color that you're looking at through the viewports is just, you know, it goes from white and grey on the sea surface, and then just different shades of light blue going to dark blue, going to completely black. And you see lots of life and organisms passing the viewports as you're falling down through the water column. And the moment where the seafloor looms up underneath the vessel, it's just fantastic. It's just fantastic. So that was a really quick sort of whistle-stop tour of a couple of the deepest places on Earth, some of the mapping that we've done, the things that we've revealed, you know, the submarine landslides, the seamounts, the bend-related faulting, these enclosed basins and everything. But these deep places, you know, they're not out of sight, out of mind. You know, there's a lot going on in them. You know, unfortunately, there are studies that have shown that we're seeing pollutants in some of the organisms that are living in these deepest places. But I mean, it's a fantastic time to be involved in marine science. You know, there's new technologies come along all the time, and allowing us to access and study these really, really deep areas. You know, the work that the three presenters today, for example, are doing. Going forward, if you consider a career in marine science, you know, multidisciplinary research is amazing. You know, you meet a wide variety of people, and you learn from the people on board the ship. You know, you start to learn about the biology down here, down in these deep places, the engineering techniques that you need to embrace. And you know, these deep areas are some of the most active and diverse on Earth, and there's always something fantastic to learn when we go to these places. So thanks very much. I'll hand back to our moderator, and I look forward to answering questions at the end.
Great, thanks very much, Heather. So our last speaker this afternoon is Veerle Hoevener from Belgium. She studied in Belgium at the University of Ghent before coming to the UK, to Southampton, to study an MSc in oceanography. Then she went back to Ghent to get her PhD before coming back to Southampton to work at the National Oceanography Centre here in the UK. So Veerle, over to you.
Right. Thank you very much, Michael. Good afternoon, everybody. So thank you very much for that introduction. And it's great to be part of this webinar. I've actually learned a lot already simply by listening in. The presentation that I will show here, I would like to focus on a topic that Heather has mentioned already a little bit, and that's the use of technology, more specifically robotic technology, to study these deep sea environments, and particularly to study the complex deep sea environments in all their facets. And as the other speakers have mentioned before, the deep sea is a vast area to survey. And because we can't use optical techniques and visual techniques, we have to rely on acoustics quite often to really start studying these areas. And Heather mentioned the use of multibeam echo sounders from ships. Although a large part of the deep ocean has not been mapped yet, we do understand now that, contrary to what people used to believe, that the deep sea is not flat and boring at all. Thousands of submarine canyons have been found, thousands of seamounts, Heather already referred to it. You have the deep sea trenches, you have the mid-ocean ridges. And it's exactly in those complex terrains that we can expect the highest biodiversity, because these terrains have so many nooks and crannies, they have so many different spaces for different species to make their home, that overall, typically the biodiversity is highest in these type of terrains. Unfortunately, they're also the most complex and the most challenging to study. And I will show in the next slide why. As the two movies show, these complex deep sea environments, they can be very, very steep. And if I say steep, I do mean vertical and in some cases overhanging. They can be subject to very strong currents, which can interfere with the equipment that we try to lower in those areas. They cover a very large depth range. Some of the submarine canyons run from the shelf edge, 200-meter water depth, all the way down to 4,000, 5,000, 6,000 meter water depth. And they are very heterogeneous, which means that if we really want to study them and understand what's happening, we need to study them at fairly high resolution to really find out what's going on. And I tend to compare studying these kind of terrains with attempting to study the Grand Canyon, but actually you have to work from a hot air balloon, and you're only allowed to work on a cloudy day. And the only type of equipment you have are video cameras or other pieces of equipment that you can lower on a cable. That's kind of the challenge we have when we try to study these deep sea environments. And that's also why we're increasingly looking at new technologies to do these studies. And while, of course, the submarine that Heather went in is the most fantastic way to study these deep sea environments, it's not available for many people. And instead, at the National Oceanography Center in Southampton, we try to focus on other solutions. And here you see a picture of the fleet of marine vehicles, mainly Autosub and robotic systems that we have in Southampton to do deep sea research. This is actually a picture from a few years ago. Some of the pieces of equipment have been decommissioned since, but we've also acquired new ones. And the examples that I would give in a minute are mainly extracted from an expedition we did in 2015 to the Whitard Canyon west of Cornwall. And during that expedition, we took along 3 different robotic vehicles, that was actually a first for the UK science community. We deployed those vehicles in a coordinated operation in this submarine canyon. And I'm just going to give you a little bit more detail about those vehicles. Oops, sorry. So the first one we call Autosub 6000. It's an autonomous underwater vehicle, also known as actually it's an autonomous submarine. So basically we pre-program it and set it off on its mission, and then it has about 28 hours of battery life, and it can go down to 6,000 meter water depth. We mainly used it to map the terrain using, again, multi-beam echo sounders, but because we can bring the vehicle much closer to the seabed, we get a much better resolution in the maps. Autosub 6000 also has the capacity to take photographs at a rate of 1 photo per second. So you can imagine how many photographs that is in 28 hours of mission. But to make good photographs of the seabed, it actually has to travel fairly close to the seabed. And in a submarine canyon or around a seamount, that's sometimes difficult. The second vehicle we had is the one on the right. It's a remotely operated vehicle, and this one is named after the Egyptian goddess Isis. And the difference there is that this robot is connected to the ship with a cable through which we can actually communicate with the robot. So it's much more interactive. We can see the video data coming in real time. We can send commands. And so we use this robot mainly for precision sampling, for high definition video, for high resolution photography. But it also does have a high resolution multi-beam echo sounder, which we sometimes use for ultra high resolution mapping in very complex terrains. And then the third robot that we took along is a Sea Glider. That's also an autonomous robot. So basically, again, we pre-program it and we set it off on its mission. And this one can actually work for days, weeks on end. We used it for 21 days continuous. And it was traveling continuously between the sea surface and 1,000 meter water depth. And it was continuously making measurements of temperature, salinity, oxygen, and turbidity. And using these 3 robots, we tried to tackle 4 challenges. We wanted to cover all the scales and depth ranges at a sufficient resolution and extent so we could understand the processes that happen in the submarine canyon. We wanted to study vertical cliffs, and we wanted to look under overhangs. We also wanted to include understanding the water column and the currents into the whole picture. And then ideally, we would like to repeat it all and monitor for any changes over a longer term, but that will not be for today. So in terms of covering all the scales and depth ranges, we applied a nested mapping technique. So we first used the ship in the same way as what Heather described for the trenches. We mapped out the broad scale canyon, but that was at a fairly low resolution. So a pixel size of 25 by 25 meters. That means we have 1 depth measurement per patch that's about the size of a swimming pool. That's good, but that doesn't give us a lot of information about where exactly certain animals live, for example. So for that, we would pick out areas of interest. For example, here, this bottom part of this branch of the canyon, and then we would deploy the autonomous underwater vehicle, and that would map out at a much higher resolution. So you now can see the very steep channel at the bottom, and you can also see the spur with these kind of mound features, these small lumps. And there we employed the even higher resolution multi-beam echo sounder of the tethered robot of ISIS. And eventually we also looked with a video camera, and we found that those small mounds were actually coral reefs. So the coral you can see here is a species that doesn't have a symbiosis, doesn't live together with algae, and therefore it doesn't need light to survive. It basically filters its food from the water column. And that means that it can live at much higher depths. We found these coral reefs at 750 to 850 meter water depth. And of course, having high definition video and photo cameras on board, we could zoom into the very fine detail and look at all the species that live between the coral framework and so on. So overall, using this nested approach, we can actually image the seafloor processes at the scale that they occur and understand the connections between fine scales and broad scales and the different processes that happen. Secondly, we wanted to look at vertical cliffs and under overhangs. And while we were doing the overall mapping of the submarine canyon, we had already noticed that some of the walls of the canyon were very, very steep. And you see the profile there through one of the branches of the canyon. And we wanted to make a map of those vertical or those steep walls. We wanted to map out the shape of them. And for that, we did something innovative. We used the echo sounder from the tethered robot from ISIS, which normally is pointing downwards, as echo sounders tend to do. But instead, we put it on the front of the vehicle and made it look forward. And then we moved the vehicle parallel to the steep wall. And we did that at different distances. We started off quite far away just to be safe, so that we wouldn't fly into anything. And that resulted in a top map. And there you can see that effectively that cliff is vertical and in some places overhanging. So we would never have been able to map that out if we would have only used equipment that looks down from the vehicles. When we came in closer, and that's the bottom map, we could actually start seeing every individual bedding plane in the geological strata of that cliff. And again, you see little lumps on them, and those are again made by cold water corals. So this is only a part of the cliff. In total, that cliff is 1.5 kilometers long and about 120 meters high. So altogether, that's quite a big reef. The next step we wanted to take was to also transfer that capability of mapping vertical walls onto our autonomous vehicle, because using the tethered vehicle to map out that wall was great, but it took a lot of time. And actually, we prefer to use our tethered vehicle to do the precision sampling. So we modified the autonomous vehicle. Our engineers developed a cliff tracking and collision avoidance system. And so it could go out and map these walls autonomously while we were taking samples somewhere else. So that's the whole thing about using these different robots at the same time. We can actually multiply the amount of information that we can gather during one expedition. And so just to show you the results. So the dots you see in the background are the data points we got from the shipboard echo sounder. So you see they're fairly sparse. And in the middle, you see the data that we got from the autonomous vehicle. And then you can see now coming into view the patch that we mapped out with the remotely operated vehicle with the tethered vehicle. So here you can really see again all the bedding planes and the real geology of the cliff. But and this is a forever trade-off in deep sea science. To get that level of information and that resolution, we needed 10 hours to map this part, while the part mapped with the autonomous vehicle only took us 2 hours. So it's always a trade-off between the amount of detail we need and the amount of money and time we have to actually map it out. And again, we followed that up with photographs to really look at all the species and where they occur and what the geology really looks like. Finally, we also wanted to describe the water column and the currents. And as I mentioned, we used this glider for that. And basically, what we did was we programmed the glider in such a way that it would stay more or less in one place in the canyon for about 30 hours, going up and down from 0 to 1,000 meter water depth. And then it would move on to a next location, stay there for 30 hours, profiling the water column, and then a next location and so on. So the red squiggles on the map are the locations where the glider was staying for 30 hours. In the two panels in the middle, you can see salinity and oxygen plotted in color against time on the x-axis and depth on the y-axis. And you can see that there are wavy patterns in that data. That's not because the glider has been going up and down through the water column. Actually, the glider went up and down much more often than that. This is actually the signature of internal tides or internal tidal waves going through the submarine canyon. So between the water masses in the canyon, on the contact between two different water masses, you can actually find waves just like you can find at the surface. And those create changes and move water particles for up to 80 meters up and down every 12 hours. And they create changes in temperature, salinity, oxygen for the corals that live on the flanks of this canyon. So again, while people used to think that in the deep sea, everything is very constant and very monotonous, it is not. Those corals get a change in temperature of a full degree every 6 to 12 hours. So just to finish, a few bits of eye candy, a few videos from our submarine canyon. So you do see those vertical and overhanging walls coming in, the corals holding on. Unfortunately, also a lot of fishing line that gets trapped between the corals. This is a different wall. We also have the coral reef that I showed you on the high resolution mapping. So those reefs are as colorful and as amazing as tropical coral reefs where you can go snorkeling. But it's not all coral and vertical walls. In some places, it's a much more sedimented area, but also there you have very interesting fauna. For example, Norway lobster, your typical langoustine when you go and have a fish platter. So with all of that, I would like to say thank you very much for giving me the opportunity to show you the amazing environment in our deep sea that we now can actually study thanks to these robotic vehicles. And I would like to say thank you to all the people who have worked with me in all those years. Cheers.
Great, thanks very much, Vera. That was a fantastic insight into what modern technology can bring to marine science. So we do have a little bit of time left over for questions. So we'll get through some of them online. We will carry on a little bit after 6 o'clock if anybody has got an extra 5 or 10 minutes to get through some of the questions. So hopefully we'll be able to get through some of them. So we'll launch straight back in, and I'll invite the panelists to answer the questions as they come up. So firstly, Tilly asks, what has been one of the best experiences of your career so far? So maybe if you could sum up in a sentence what you would say was one of your best career experiences.
Well, gosh, I think just field work, and I think going down to the Southern Ocean. Yeah, I mean, just all field work. I couldn't have done a job where I was stuck in the office all the time. So actually, lockdown has been really hard.
Yeah, I would agree. Fieldwork, working with people from different disciplines, and that's the thing about marine science. When you take a ship to sea, it's impossible to only take the people who work in your specific field. A ship costs so much, so you have to bring everybody who has to work on that same area, which makes it very, very interesting for you because you can discuss with lots of people. And for me, also the Southern Ocean was the most amazing one.
Yes, same for me, being on a research vessel with a fantastic crew, fantastic brains working together, and then doing frontier things nobody has done before, kind of drilling deep into, we drill between two plates in one of the expedition. and just we're waiting and excited to have that our little sleep, excitement, discoveries. Those are great moments.
Great, thanks very much, everyone. So yeah, the next question is from Ramandeep. So I think this one's for Viola. Did your oceanography degree have a good mix of geography and science? Apparently they're in sixth form and they love both, but they're really interested in the marine world, but they're not quite sure what degree to do.
It's an interesting question. So yes, I did a master's in oceanography here in Southampton, and it was a good mix of all the aspects of marine science, so chemistry, biology, geology, geophysics. I think nowadays they even have marine law in there, so you become a really rounded researcher. However, my first degree was a little bit left field. I am actually a biosciences engineer in land and forest management. So that's a bit different, but we learned a lot about geographic information systems, geology, geography. And I would say if you're interested in science and marine world, try to take a very broad degree so you can look at the ocean and at what you find interesting in a holistic way. Don't just focus on a specific topic and go down a very narrow path from the beginning. Start broad.
Great, thanks very much. So Danwu asks, areas that are now on land were clearly once below the surface of the sea, i.e. sandy areas and things. Have you come across any deep below the sea that shows signs of having once been above the surface? So that wasn't directed to anybody, but I guess anybody who wants to jump in and answer that one.
I can try to take that. And I think Heather showed these submarine landslides, this tremendous amount of mass wasting where entire continental margin collapsed. So I haven't actually seen it offshore, but I know it from the rock record in the Alps, where you basically have deep sea sediments deposited several kilometers below seafloor, and you find bleached corals and actually shore face that have been by such mass wasting events. So that's one possible mechanism how you can bring shore or previously on land to the deep sea.
I have an example as well, actually. When we were in the Puerto Rico trench and we deployed, some of the robotic equipment and the submarine to the deepest part of the Puerto Rico trench, so over 8,000 meters, there was an awful lot of something called Sargassum. And Sargassum is something that grows along the coast. It's a sort of type of seagrass type thing. And during tropical storms that hit the coastline, it breaks free and it floats out over the Puerto Rico trench, and then it sinks. So you get these tufts and lots of sargassum at sort of 8,300 meters deep. So it's really important sort of carbon sink as well. So there's quite a lot of research looking at that.
Fantastic.
If I may add a really sad one. There is plastic being discovered in the deep sea trenches, obviously anthropogenically caused. That's also has been on land before.
Yeah, no, I know there's a lot of research going on to understand the way in which the circulation of the oceans leads to plastic distribution as well. So we've got time for a couple more. So Sivateya, I hope I've pronounced that right, asks, is it possible for an earthquake to occur nearby or at the same surface location of a previous earthquake? I think that might be one for you, Mickey. Yeah.
Yes. The answer is yes, and the explanation is time. Because if we look on long time scales, tens, hundreds, thousands of years, an earthquake or fault, a plate boundary that ruptured and caused an earthquake will, due to ongoing plate movements on our planet, just a few centimeters per year. The plate move about as fast as your fingernail grow. That's the speed of plates. And if you think in longer terms, 100 years, 1,000 years, then you can gain again the friction energy that is being released exactly at the same point. And actually our expedition is all about understanding such recurrence of the same area that ruptures. And the question is, how often do they rupture and what's the time scale in between?
Okay, thank you. So yeah, one or two more. So this one's an anonymous question for Heather. How did you get to become the seafloor mapper on the 5 Deeps expedition?
Luck, no. I've been working in the sort of marine environment for, gosh, almost 20 years now. But I was working with Alan Jameson, who was chief scientist for it. So I got invited because I'd also been working in other trenches, the Kermadec Trench, the Atacama Trench, and the Mariana Trench, looking at the shape, the morphology of the seafloor and the sort of sediments that are down there, but not as deep time as Mickey has been going on. So that's kind of how I ended up on board the 5 Deeps. But there was so much work to do. We actually employed a dedicated hydrographic surveyor, so Cassie Bongiovanni, who was just out of university, early career researcher, and she came on board and ran the multi-beam system for us as well.
Okay, thank you very much. The next question, I hope people are still interested. I see quite a lot of attendees still on the call, so hopefully the panelists are good to carry on for a few minutes. So a question here again, it's anonymous. I think this one's for Mickey, but feel free to jump in, anyone else. Is the ocean losing water at subduction zones? And if it is, does it reappear somewhere else?
That's a very good question, and it's always about the system you defined. So indeed, there's water being dragged below, either in the water in the pore space of the ocean floor, and the deeper it gets, there's decompression and fluids, water fluid cycles, just fantastic phenomena, mud volcanoes, and seeps, and all these kind of things. And then there is also a kind of a mineralogenic, so the ocean floor actually reacts. So there is mineral transformation if water circulates through the ocean floor, and then these minerals, they go really deep, below 30-40 kilometers, and then they dehydrate again, and then there are interesting earth processes that actually kind of make the plate melting, and that's where the volcano grow when they erupt. So it's all about cycles, and water, yes, absolutely plays a very important role in many processes.
Fantastic. Next one on the list, I think this is probably towards Vila, but again, any of you can chip in. So how has the nature of your work changed with advancements in technology?
I think the biggest change is that we slowly start knowing a bit better what we're sampling and what we're doing down there. So hence my cartoon at the start with the idea of like throwing a camera over the side of a hot air balloon basket. I think up to like 20 years ago or something, people would study the deep sea by taking samples and using trawls and dredges, but actually it's feeling your way through the dark. And by developing these technologies where we can map with higher resolution, or where we can actually create proper video, or actually go down there with the submarines yourself, we start to have a better idea of where our samples come from and what story they exactly tell us.
Great. So another one for Heather now. I'm picking this one out of the list because I think it's really interesting myself. So hi, Heather. This is from Alan Baxter. Did you record any other geophysical or acoustic data sets during the 5 Deeps expedition? He put some examples: backscatter, parasound, magnetics, gravity data. And will the data from the expedition be released to the community anytime soon?
Yeah, great question. So we did get backscatter data with the water depth information. So multibeam records 2 different types of information, sort of backscatter, which is like the intensity of the return signal, and water depth information. So we do have that data, and we have been using that. We couldn't do sort of parasound and magnetics and gravity because of where using the submarine as well. The submarine was taking up that sort of deck space that would otherwise have been available for lots of other different types of equipment. And the data is all available. We have we've just published all the data. It's all freely available to download and to play with. I put a link in the in the chat earlier to the BBC article, and the link to the data is in that BBC article. But also there's an initiative called Seabed 2030, which is really ambitious, and they aim to map 100% of the oceans by the year 2030. And we've also donated all of the data that we acquired, not just from the deeps, but all of the transits between all of the ocean basins, all those journeys across the oceans that we did to get to all of the points of interest. So all of that data has also been submitted to them, and that will be publicly available in due course.
Great. There's another question that's come in that kind of links to that one quite nicely, so I'll pick that one out of the list as well. So it's anonymous, but how do you think society benefits from your research? This person personally thinks it's fascinating, but yeah, I guess that's an interesting question. How does, you know, out and out academic research lead to different, you know, different understandings and potentially, you know, a benefit for society as a whole? You can
Yeah,
why don't you all give your opinion in turn?
Yeah. Okay, yeah, I mean, there's, oh gosh, multiple reasons, from marine law and law of the sea to just getting a better understanding as to what's going on, so that we can make better informed decisions about how we're using our blue economy, the resources that are available in the marine environment. We use it for conservation. For example, the South Sandwich Trench is located within one of the biggest marine protected areas in the world, and they didn't have any information from the deepest part of that marine protected area. So we're working through the Darwin Initiative to feed all that information and the findings from that trench back into the sort of the people that manage the marine protected area, and help them make better sort of informed decisions in the future.
Vela, do you want to come in on that as well?
Yeah, I think I'll pick up on that point. So same thing with the mapping and the research that I've shown. All these cold water corals, for example, they're a fantastic habitat. They're nursery habitat for small fish. They have a lot of biodiversity, and so that information again feeds into conservation measures. We've just participated in a consultation from the Marine Management Organization, because in the flanks of the Whithard Canyon there is a marine conservation zone where they were designing the management measures for fisheries. So we were feeding all our information into that. In addition, I could also point to the fact that a lot of new pharmaceutical components are actually derived from marine animals, like anemones and sponges tend to be quite good at making crazy chemicals that actually are quite useful for pharmaceutical products. And then the other reason I think to study the deep ocean, apart from the resource management, as what Heather hinted to, is, and I'm picking up another question that sits in the chat, is what's happening with our marine environment under climate change. One would think that the deep ocean is far away from what happens in the atmosphere where all the CO2 builds up, but the CO2 gets mixed into the ocean and gradually gets mixed into the deep ocean. And so we can see that the ocean becomes more acidic, which is a problem for benthic life that's built on calcium carbonate, such as cold water corals. So they have more and more difficulties building their skeletons. So that's another reason to follow up what happens in these marine habitats and how species live.
Great. Well, I think we'll do one more, and this is a question for Mickey. What do you mean by natural seismometers?
Yeah, I was using a metaphor, so I was figuratively speaking. A seismometer is an instrument that records the earthquake, the earth shaking on like a meter, and records the shaking. And natural, I mean something that has not been developed by mankind, but that is basically our nature that records such earthquakes, and we use, and these are the sediments, as I try to explain, and we use basically, I mean, earthquakes and tsunamis, it's all about hazard, right? There are epidemistic uncertainties in hazard assessment. Many natural disaster, mankind just is, and you know, it's paradigm shift if nature shows us our power. So that's why I use this metaphor. that we need to read our natural recorders, our natural seismometers, that we can reduce, that we can provide observational data that then feed into this natural hazard and risk assessment and mitigation strategy. For this low recurrent, like low probability, but high impact waves that drive our planet every decade or we don't really know, right? We don't know how often such disaster occur. That's why we do this research.
Brilliant. Well, I think we'll finish there. So yeah, thank you firstly to our speakers for coming and sharing some of their research and expertise with us. Thank you for everybody watching on both Zoom and YouTube for dialing in and spending some time with us, learning a little bit more about the deepest ocean. And thank you for all your questions. The Marine Studies group will be putting out another webinar later in the year. So keep an eye on our distribution list and Twitter and LinkedIn and Instagram for that. And yeah, have a pleasant evening if you're in the UK and a pleasant rest of the day if you're anywhere else. So thanks very much for dialing in and speak to you all soon.